The war in Europe had reached its final desperate stages, but the battlefield was far from ordinary. American soldiers, trained to follow the rules of engagement and honor, suddenly faced a terrifying and insidious enemy tactic. German snipers and fanatical hit squads had abandoned their uniforms, shedding the marks of organized military, and instead donned civilian clothes. They carried white flags, a symbol of surrender and trust, but beneath these flags lurked death. These were not ordinary combatants. They were part of Hitler's secret Werwolf insurgency, a group trained to exploit the decency and discipline of Allied forces. In towns reduced to rubble and streets littered with the remnants of a collapsing Third Reich, these disguised soldiers set up ambushes with meticulous precision. They waited in basements, behind broken walls, and among piles of debris, ready to strike the moment an unsuspecting American approached. For the troops who had survived months of intense combat, the psychological impact was immediate. Every white flag became suspect, every gesture of surrender potentially lethal. Trust had turned into paranoia, and soldiers began to hesitate, knowing that a single step could mean death. Reports of these incidents spread quickly. Units spoke in hushed tones about the white flag traps, recounting how entire squads had been caught off guard, some even decimated simply because they had followed the conventions of war. Commanders recognized that this was not only a tactical challenge, but a moral one. The Germans had weaponized human decency, and for the first time in many soldiers' experiences, doing the right thing could lead to fatal consequences. Yet, in the midst of fear and confusion, stories emerged of men who acted with quick thinking and courage. Soldiers learned to scan for subtle signs, the way the flag was held, the behavior of the figure behind it, the timing of a movement. These moments of acute awareness were a matter of life and death, and those who survived often credited a mixture of instinct, training, and sheer luck. Some accounts describe soldiers noticing irregular folds in the fabric, hesitant gestures, or unnatural stillness, small anomalies that betrayed the trap. Such vigilance became the difference between survival and being struck down in a cruel twist of fate. The American command knew that conventional responses were no longer sufficient. Leaders began to study patterns, report anomalies, and adapt strategies. The presence of these hidden threats forced the army to reconsider how they approached every surrendered enemy. What had once been a symbol of hope, the white flag, had become a signal of potential ambush, a warning that the line between mercy and menace was dangerously thin. Intelligence officers worked around the clock, collecting reports from frontline units, analyzing enemy tactics, and trying to predict where the next ambush might occur. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Soldiers moved cautiously through shattered villages, their senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat. Amid this growing tension, a single figure loomed larger than any individual unit or tactic. General George S. Patton, known for his boldness and relentless drive, understood that fear alone could not dictate the outcome. The enemy sought to exploit hesitation, to turn American discipline into vulnerability. Patton's reputation for decisive action, unflinching courage, and unorthodox solutions would soon meet the werewolf threat head-on. Soldiers whispered about his legendary temper and his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy moves. The stage was set for confrontation, and the hidden danger of the white flags would test not only strategy and skill, but the very nerve of those tasked with facing it. Every decision, every step, and every command would carry the weight of survival. And for those caught behind a white flag, the difference between life and death hung by a thread. Even as the rubble of Europe stretched endlessly, and the echoes of distant artillery rolled across the countryside, the soldiers knew that vigilance was the only path to survival. There could be no hesitation, no second guessing, because the enemy was ready to exploit every ounce of trust. The white flags, once a sign of hope, had become the most dangerous weapon of all, a silent test of courage, wit, and nerve.
As the Allies pressed deeper into Germany, the Werwolf insurgency intensified its campaign of terror. These were no longer isolated incidents. They were systematic operations designed to undermine morale and sow chaos. American troops began to encounter entire squads of German fighters who had shed their uniforms, blending into the ruins of cities and villages, often armed with concealed weapons and ready to strike under the guise of surrender. What had once been a clear distinction between combatant and non-combatant had vanished, replaced by a deadly gray zone where caution and bravery walked a fine line. Reports filtered in from the front lines of ambushes so cunningly executed that even seasoned officers struggled to comprehend them. Soldiers told of entire buildings where every door and window hid a sniper, each seemingly innocent civilian concealing a deadly rifle. Patrols would approach a group holding a white flag, only to be met with precise, lethal fire. The enemy had discovered the vulnerability in American discipline, the natural inclination to honor surrender, and weaponized it. It was cowardice masquerading as civility, and it had the power to cut down even the most experienced men. Psychologically, the impact was devastating. Troops who had endured months of combat and witnessed unimaginable destruction now faced the realization that conventional rules of warfare no longer applied. Trust became a liability. Every surrender, every plea for mercy, every movement of a flag could be a signal of death. Soldiers had to train themselves to anticipate deceit, to question instinctive reactions, and to balance humanity with survival. The moral weight was enormous. Act with compassion and risk death. Act with suspicion and risk violating the very principles they had fought to uphold. Yet amid the terror, extraordinary acts of courage emerged. Small units learned to develop new strategies for approaching suspected traps, often using smoke, artillery, or flanking maneuvers to flush out hidden enemies. Stories circulated of soldiers who noticed subtle irregularities, the way a flag hung unnaturally stiff, a civilian figure pausing too long before moving, or the unnatural silence in a street otherwise alive with the sounds of war. These details, easily overlooked by the untrained eye, became life-saving signals for those who could spot them. Commanders at all levels understood that the usual chain of orders and tactics was insufficient. Intelligence officers meticulously gathered reports from each incident, piecing together the patterns of ambush and deception. Entire strategies were rewritten to account for this treacherous form of warfare. Artillery units prepared preemptive strikes, infantry adjusted their formations, and reconnaissance became an even more critical component of survival. Every mission carried a heightened risk, not only from enemy fire, but from the moral trap the Germans had set. Patton, observing the chaos and reports from the front, recognized that a passive approach would lead to unnecessary casualties. Hesitation and overcaution were luxuries the army could no longer afford. He demanded decisive action, swift countermeasures, and a relentless pursuit of those who used deceit as a weapon. His men, inspired by his fearlessness, adapted quickly. Where fear might have frozen ordinary soldiers, Patton's leadership instilled a sense of controlled aggression, teaching troops to respect the threat without being paralyzed by it. By the end of these encounters, the Americans had begun to learn the rules of this new, dishonorable game. The white flag no longer guaranteed safety, but it no longer guaranteed death either. Each engagement became a test of observation, courage, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. Soldiers discovered that survival required not just skill with a weapon, but keen perception, rapid judgment, and the willingness to confront cowardice with force. The stage was now set for Patton to escalate the response, turning the tables on the werewolf insurgents who had hoped to exploit honor as a weapon.
When reports of white flag ambushes reached General George S. Patton, he did not flinch. Where others might have hesitated, weighed the moral dilemmas, or allowed caution to dominate, Patton saw only one option: decisive action. He understood that the enemy had weaponized human decency, and any delay or indecision could cost lives. To him, hesitation was a luxury he could not afford, and he would not allow his men to become victims of cowardice masquerading as surrender. Patton's mind worked quickly, analyzing patterns, gathering intelligence, and envisioning how to confront this insidious threat with precision and force. He called meetings with his senior officers, insisting on detailed reports of every encounter with suspected werewolf units. Maps were spread across tables, pins marking every location where white flag incidents had occurred. Patton's eyes scanned each mark, calculating how ambushes had been set, where they might strike next, and how to turn the tables. "We will meet their treachery with justice," he said, his voice sharp, leaving no room for doubt. Orders were drafted with a single goal: protect his troops while crushing the enemy's willingness to exploit American honor. Patton's response was not reckless bravado. It was methodical, strategic, and ruthless when necessary. He redefined the rules of engagement for units under his command, emphasizing vigilance, immediate counteraction, and the use of overwhelming firepower when deceit was suspected. Troops were trained to anticipate ambushes, to approach white flags with caution, and to use artillery and armor as both deterrent and weapon. Patrols were instructed to secure buildings, clear streets systematically, and maintain constant communication with command. Every soldier became a part of a larger system designed to neutralize the hidden threat before it could strike. The general's presence alone inspired confidence. Soldiers knew that Patton would not tolerate indecision or cowardice, either among the enemy or his own ranks. Letters and diaries from this period revealed the morale boost his decisiveness provided. Men who had been haunted by fear found a renewed sense of purpose and security under his leadership. He demanded respect for the dangers they faced, but also instilled a fearlessness that allowed them to act boldly without hesitation. Patton also understood the psychological warfare at play. The werewolf insurgents relied on the assumption that American soldiers would hesitate, bound by the rules of conduct and the expectation of honorable behavior. Patton shattered that assumption. By demonstrating that deception would be met with swift, overwhelming force, he began to strip the enemy of their advantage. Ambushes were preempted, traps exposed, and the morale of the insurgents began to crack under pressure. Even in the midst of chaos, Patton emphasized calculated aggression. He insisted that each response be precise, minimizing unnecessary risk to civilians while punishing the treachery of those who used surrender as a weapon. Patton's combination of boldness, strategic insight, and unflinching resolve turned fear into action. American troops moved with purpose through devastated villages, confident that hesitation would no longer be their undoing. By the end of these initial countermeasures, the werewolf threat had begun to meet its match. Patton's approach combined intelligence, psychological insight, and relentless tactical pressure, forcing the enemy to adapt or be destroyed. The white flag, once a symbol of potential death, was now a calculated challenge met with vigilance, skill, and decisive force. Patton had transformed a source of fear into a tool for controlled, effective retaliation, and his troops understood that under his command, no cowardly deception would go unpunished.
As the werewolf insurgency continued to prey on American soldiers, General Patton knew that ordinary tactics would no longer suffice. The enemy had exploited discipline and decency, and a stronger, more decisive response was required. The solution came in the form of firepower, the kind that left no doubt, no hesitation, and no room for deception. Patton's 75mm artillery became both a symbol and a tool of retribution, delivering swift justice to those who dared hide behind the white flag. American units, now trained to anticipate the enemy's treachery, coordinated closely with artillery teams. Intelligence reports identified the positions where ambushes had been staged: buildings, ruined streets, and concealed basements. At Patton's command, the 75mm guns roared to life. Soldiers learned that patience, precision, and timing were as critical as courage. One miscalculation could endanger his own men, but Patton's insistence on careful coordination ensured maximum effect against the hidden enemy. The psychological impact on the Werwolf units was immediate. These fanatical insurgents had relied on fear, deception, and the assumption that the Americans would hesitate. Now, every attempt at ambush was met with overwhelming force. The 75mm shells tore through walls, shredded concealments, and left the insurgents no place to hide. Survivors recount the terror of realizing that the same discipline they had sought to exploit was now turned against them with ruthless efficiency. What had once been a clever trick became a deadly trap, engineered by Patton's strategic brilliance. Reports from the front lines describe entire buildings collapsing under precision fire, snipers eliminated before they could raise a weapon, and ambushes destroyed before they could claim a single life. For the American soldiers, witnessing the devastating effect of 75mm artillery provided both relief and reassurance. The danger of the white flag was not removed entirely, but the balance had shifted decisively. The enemy learned that deceit would not go unpunished, and Patton's men learned that courage, training, and coordination could overcome even the most insidious tactics. Patton did not treat these actions as mindless vengeance. He emphasized discipline, ensuring that civilians were spared whenever possible and that artillery strikes were carefully calculated. The goal was to eliminate the threat while maintaining honor and order, a reflection of his philosophy that warfare required both ruthlessness against the enemy and responsibility toward innocents. Every strike was deliberate, every shell counted, and every decision was executed with the precision of a commander who understood both the art and science of war. The term 75mm justice began to circulate among soldiers, a grim nickname for the artillery strikes that had turned the tide against the Werwolf insurgency. It was a justice that was swift, uncompromising, and undeniably effective. The once feared white flags now carried a new meaning. They were no longer a tool for cowardice, but a challenge met with skill, courage, and decisive force. Patton had transformed fear into power, turning the enemy's deception against them and protecting his men from the deadly traps that had once stalked the shattered streets of Germany. As operations continued, the scale of Patton's strategy became clear. Entire districts that had been rendered nearly unapproachable due to sniper ambushes were now cleared systematically. Artillery crews synchronized with infantry units, advancing cautiously but relentlessly through ruined neighborhoods, ensuring that every potential threat was neutralized before it could strike again. Soldiers described the overwhelming sense of security, knowing that any hidden enemy would face swift retaliation. Every 75mm shell fired was a warning, a demonstration that cowardice, trickery, and betrayal would meet unyielding force. Patton's had transformed fear into a tool, turning a weapon once designed to terrorize into a means of protecting his men and punishing those who sought to exploit their humanity.
The final weeks of the war were a test not only of strategy, but of human endurance and morality. With the werewolf threat largely neutralized, American soldiers finally had a chance to breathe, though the echoes of danger still lingered in every ruined street and shattered building. Survivors recounted the constant tension, the ever-present fear that a white flag could conceal a deadly ambush. Many carried the memories of fallen comrades, men lost to treachery,
and the moral weight of having to question surrender in a war where rules had been weaponized against them. For General Patton, the end of these campaigns was not simply about victory, it was about survival, discipline, and the preservation of his troops. He ensured that every operation, every response, and every deployment was analyzed and learned from. Soldiers were debriefed, and intelligence reports were meticulously reviewed to understand the enemy's strategies and weaknesses. The lessons were clear: vigilance, decisiveness, and adaptability could overcome even the most insidious tactics. Those who had once felt terror in the face of deception now moved with confidence, knowing that preparation and courage could prevail. The consequences of the Werwolf campaign extended beyond the battlefield. Civilians who had been caught in the crossfire and those who had been coerced into hiding the insurgents suffered the aftermath. Patton's forces worked quickly to restore order, provide security, and mitigate further danger. Yet the psychological scars remained. Soldiers struggled with the memory of comrades struck down behind false surrenders, and many grappled with the moral complexity of responding with overwhelming force. These were not simple victories, they were hard-won lessons in the realities of modern warfare, where honor and deceit could collide in deadly ways. Despite the destruction and moral ambiguity, Patton's leadership ensured that his forces emerged stronger, more disciplined, and capable of facing any threat. The Werwolf units had relied on fear, trickery, and cowardice. Patton turned that fear back upon them. By using intelligence, strategy, and decisive firepower, he protected his men and dismantled the enemy's plans. The survivors, hardened by the trials of the campaign, carried forward not only their skills, but also a deep understanding of courage under pressure. The final days of the conflict saw the remnants of Werwolf forces scattered, their influence waning. Patton's men moved through devastated towns, reclaiming streets and buildings, and ensuring that no threat remained hidden. Every step forward was both a tactical achievement and a symbolic victory, the triumph of discipline and bravery over deception and cowardice. Soldiers came to understand that survival required not only skill with weapons, but mental sharpness, awareness, and the ability to make rapid decisions under the most harrowing circumstances. As the dust settled on Europe, the stories of these battles became part of the legend of Patton. The white flag, once a tool of terror, had been transformed into a symbol of challenge met with skill and decisive force. Soldiers remembered the fear they had faced, the cleverness of the enemy, and the ruthless justice of 75mm artillery. In the end, survival had a price: vigilance, courage, and the willingness to act when others hesitated. Patton's campaigns against the Werwolf units left a lasting mark, not just in the rubble of towns, but in the hearts and minds of those who had endured, survived, and ultimately prevailed. Even years later, veterans spoke of these days with a mixture of awe and solemn respect. The lessons of deception, courage, and the brutal clarity of Patton's approach became part of their understanding of war itself. Survival was not guaranteed by following the rules, nor by waiting for mercy. It was earned through observation, decisive action, and the unyielding resolve of men who refused to be victims of cowardice. The legacy of these final campaigns was a testament to the discipline, leadership, and unflinching courage that defined Patton and the men who fought under him.